Okay students, so the homework for this weekend, for Tuesday, first little section here is a multiple choice, or two potential multiple choices, but around calculations. So you've got a mini case study here, it's telling you a little bit about the minimum wage and it being a bit different for different ages. So 360 if you're 22, £3.21. After 10 years, since it's been introduced, it's up to £6.50. Now, what you've then got is some information about the change in the minimum wage during that period in nominal terms. You then have an index of average UK earnings, but then you also have information about the consumer price index, and you can see that that's 100 up to 44. So you have a 44% increase in the price level during that period. So the first question is the percentage change in the main rate of the minimum wage between 1999 and 2014. So it's just the difference between those divided by the original. Then you've got what the real value of the minimum wage is. So you need to discount that minimum wage, taking into account that 44% increase in the consumer price index. And you've got 4 selections for both of those questions. The last question, using marginal revenue product, and remember marginal revenue product is the same as demand when it comes to labour. Explain why countries such as Greece and the UK have different minimum wage rates for different age groups. So think about linked into productivity, the output for each individual worker. Why would you be justified in paying different rates for different people? If you can, think about how you might show that on the graph. Okay, so the homework or the questions linked to the case study you're going to look at, using a diagram, analyse the impact of trade unions under a system of collective bargaining on labour. So as it's a diagram, it's going to be a supply and demand diagram. I'll come on to that in a second. Assess the impacts of public sector wage freezes on the labour markets in a country. So we've got two sides because of the assess, positives and negatives. So public sector wage is being frozen. That's not a decrease, it just means that there's a 0% increase in it on labour markets. So it doesn't just want you to look at the public sector labour market, because the plural there, you'd be looking at private sector labour markets as well. And lastly, discuss the effectiveness. So again, two-sided plus a judgment. Effectiveness, so we're going to have an extent to answer towards the judgment. Government intervention in reducing labour immobility. Okay, so case study. Time for an EU to set a minimum wage. Growing belief that wage will be set at an EU level. As a result, the EU trade union movement has seen the need to develop a strategy to protect the level of wages of workers in different countries. So you've got a little bit of application here about trade unions wanting to protect wages. Suggestion to set a minimum wage throughout Europe relative rather than absolute terms, involving each country setting its own national minimum wage in relation to the country's national average wage. A minimum level of at least 60% of the national average wage in the member country has been proposed by the unions. So again, you've got a specific quote there, at least 60%, as being a bit of application for unions wanting higher wages. In February 2012, the Greek government agreed to deep cuts in the country's minimum wage, for example 22%, and for those under 25 even more, 32%. In addition, a public sector wage freeze was imposed. So we have the example of a public sector wage freeze, but you also have a little bit of information about a wider context point there, that there may be cuts in the rest of the economy as well. Extract 2, George Osborne declaring war on public sector with pay freeze. Government today was accused of waging war on the public services as they announced a 2-year public sector pay freeze. So again, a bit of application, 2-year pay freeze, which applies to all public sectors workers earning over 2,100. This will save £3.3 billion a year by 2015. To mitigate accusations of unfairness, £250 annual increase was given to the 1.7 million public sector staff earning less than 21,000. So it's not a full public sector wage freeze. Those on the lowest incomes will actually see a small increase. Osborne also promised to ensure that senior salaries are more closely linked to those on the lowest earners, so those at the top of the public organisations are paid no more than 20 times the salaries of those at the bottom. So that will reduce that high pay gap between those at the top and the bottom. Inflation running at 5.1%. It will mean a real cut in living standards for millions of already struggling to pay bills. So there is a key bit of information there about it cutting the real incomes for people, even if it is a wage freeze. Government needs to be wary of the dangers of a squeeze on public sector pay. It's cutting costs at the expense of public sector recruitment and retention difficulties. So it's saying that there may be a negative impact. In the longer term, this would harm the quality of public services, as public sector employees would have to make do with lower quality staff. History suggests the period of pay restraint are subsequently followed by periods of public sector pay inflation. So this may be only temporary, where earnings are raised to competitive levels. Some economists argue he's tackling the wrong problem, and geographical and occupational mobility are more serious in terms of impact on the economy. Getting these workers into jobs would boost government tax revenues and reduce the need for public sector cuts. Okay, so coming back to the questions. Firstly, using a diagram, analyse the impact of trade unions under a system of collective bargaining on labour. So you have the supply of labour, the demand of labour, its wages rather than prices. Unions are going to negotiate a wage above the market equilibrium. The slight difference between this and the other graphs you've drawn, where the wage is in a disequilibrium, is that the supply line just becomes the new wage line. So workers would accept any wage above that, but the union is guaranteed a minimum amount for them, but above the market equilibrium. So it's similar to the effect of a minimum wage. So you would have W1, you'd in theory have an increase in the amount of people making themselves available for work. However, you also have the reduction in demand for workers from the businesses themselves. So it's the similar kind of analysis that you would have for a minimum wage, but it's negotiated by the union above the equilibrium. But the key analysis is that it would be a higher wage level for the staff, and then you can analyse the quantities as well if you've got time. Okay, so the assess question, two-sided one. Impacts of a public sector wage freeze. So again, the analysis is similar to a minimum wage, or a maximum wage, sorry, but the maximum wage would be set at the current level. So you're going to have a maximum wage here rather than a minimum wage, and the price or the wage can't rise above that level, but the quantity can change. So now what you have is a situation where people may leave the public sector because they're getting a real decrease in their incomes. So that's one key bit of analysis, that because inflation is rising, and if nominal wages don't rise, then there'll be a real decrease in wages or income. And if that means that people leave the market, the quantity would fall, but the wage can't fall. In terms of the impact on other markets, and this is how you can get the other side of impacts, in the private sector, there may be an increase in people making themselves available for work, and that would reduce the wages in the private sector. So you would end up with a lower wage as more people make themselves available for work. And lastly, discuss the effectiveness of government intervention in reducing labour immobility. So the policies you have here are things like subsidies for housing, and that would increase the amount of available housing, bringing down the prices of housing and accommodation. and then that would allow people to be able to afford to live in London. It could be, again, subsidising capital for businesses, so that businesses would move there to a place of high unemployment. Or it could be the public sector moving and moving the jobs to an area of high unemployment. So the key solutions to geographical immobility are move the people to the jobs. One way you can do that is through subsidies, move the jobs to the people, and you can do that through subsidising businesses directly to invest in those areas, or moving public sector jobs there. If you were going to tackle occupational mobility, then you'd be talking about training and giving people the required skills to be able to move to those areas. In terms of why they might not work, so they may be trained, but they lack the experience that might be needed to go with it, or that there are other geographical immobility issues. When it comes to the subsidies, you may get oversupply or the supply of the wrong type of housing. So they can be indiscriminate, they may be supplying, there may be inefficient businesses as well, so they may be making a loss. In terms of the public sector move, the people might move with their jobs. So you move the jobs, but then the people in the destination don't have the skills, so the current people move to take their jobs in the new area. One key thing can be kind of a coordination or a priority in terms of evaluating. So do you need to educate and then move the public sector jobs? Because that would mean that there'd be the willing and ability to take those jobs. You could look at it from the public and private sector argument of maybe that subsidies for the private sector might be less effective than if the government built social housing. And then it could build the specific things that people need on incomes. You could look at it potentially being more effective in terms of, is it the people or the jobs that need to move? You could argue that there's other reasons apart from just the workers why a business would want to locate in the southeast. There is lots of extra infrastructure there and economies of scale from these businesses being close together. So it's unlikely that a major world bank is going to move from the financial sector of London up to Newcastle when all of the legal system is there, the stock market is there, the accountancy firms are there, the universities that specialise in training economists are there. So it may be that moving the people might be a more effective solution in that situation.